much for being here. How lucky did we get with the weather today? We have a really great conversation planned. We're really thrilled. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Before we start, I want to remind you all, you've probably heard this multiple times. I'll say it again because it's so important. Books are available from all of our authors who are on stage today. And the best way to support an author is to buy their book. And so we have them on sale from Greenlight Bookstore outside on the plaza. Immediately following our talk today, we will have all of our authors signing their books, so you do have that option. And when the program is over, we just ask everybody to exit the room quickly so that they can prepare and turn over for the next panel. So those are the logistics. We're gonna start today. I'm gonna read our panelist bios so you can get to know them a little bit more. And after I introduce each panelist, they're gonna share a personal food story or memory just to situate the talk and get us ready for the conversation. So let's start with Abby. Abby is a Filipino American home baker and author based in Brooklyn. Her debut cookbook, Mayumu, Filipino American Desserts Remixed, was released in February. When she's not working full-time at a live music company, she's running a baking blog called The Dusky Kitchen. Her hashtag Pasalubong Treat Box series helps to raise money for mutual aid organizations. She's been featured in Bon Appetit, Food and Wine, Eater, Thrillist, Food 52, and more. So with that, over to Abby.
Thank you. I guess my biggest food memory that I can think of is growing up, we'd have a lot of halo halo, which is the Filipino shaved ice dessert. And I would just like eat the ice cream first, and I'd give the rest to my mom because I really, really like the ice cream, so I felt a little demonic, but it was really good.
Thank you, Abby. Next up, we have Eric Kim. Eric is a New York Times staff writer and essayist born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. His debut cookbook, Korean American Food That Tastes Like Home, was an instant New York Times bestseller. A former digital manager for the Food Network, contributing editor for Memoir magazine, and senior editor for Food 52, where he amassed a devoted readership for his Table for One column, he now hosts regular videos on New York Times Cooking's YouTube channel and writes a monthly column for the New York Times Magazine. He lives with his rescue pup, Quentin Compson, in New York City.
Earlier when she was like, I'm gonna make you say something after your bio, I thought she was gonna ask us to tell which lines we want to cut out of the bio. So I always forget to like cut it down, and then you hear them read it, and you're like, okay. Anyway, my story is, I would say, this is my earliest memory. I must have been 1 or 2, or maybe even younger than that. But I know that Rugrats was playing, and I think that show aired 1991, 1992 or something. And Tommy Pickles throws, he squeezes the milk bottle, you know? And I remember going to a store with my mother, buying a Barney's plastic bottle, her boiling it, her filling with milk, and then me trying to squeeze that bottle, but it was plastic and I couldn't. So that's my earliest memory, and it's just crazy because there's too many specific details for that to not have been real, you know? And I don't know when children stop drinking from a bottle, but hopefully it was, by the time I was a certain age.
Thank you, Eric. Next up, Elizabeth Ann Quirino is a New Jersey-based, award-winning journalist, food writer, cookbook author, and memoirist. Previously a college professor and advertising creative director, Elizabeth develops recipes centered on Filipino home cooking on her website, The Quirino Kitchen. Her writing is inspired by stories of her mother's courage and heroism in the face of insurmountable obstacles. Her most recent book is Every Ounce of Courage, A Daughter's Reflections on Her Mother's Bravery.
Thank you. Good morning. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Betty Ann Quirino, and one of my fondest food memories was when I was a child growing up in the Philippines. Every summer, my mother and the whole household staff and I would make mango jam from the mangoes my father grew in our orchard. It was one of the most significant memories of my childhood because all summer that's what we did, make mango jam for many years, from morning, early morning till evening, and for many months after, we will be enjoying that mango jam. It was one of the best jams I've ever had in my life. So after my parents died, and when we moved here and immigrated to the United States, and it was mango season, I thought, well, why don't I just make mango jam? The sad part was that I suddenly realized I didn't have the recipe. I regretted never asking my mother all those years. I always thought there'd be a jar of mango jam in the kitchen. And this time it was my turn. So I spent years experimenting, trying with different mango varieties. And it took me a while to finally get the exact taste, flavor, and texture. And then I realized what was wrong. Not only did I not have the recipes, but it was not my father's mangoes. So, you know, to this day, that memory stays with me. It's a bittersweet memory, but it'll stay with me for a long, long time. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Next up, last but not least, Priya Krishna is a food reporter for the New York Times and also a best-selling author of multiple cookbooks, including Indian-ish and Cooking at Home. She hosts an online video series for the New York Times that looks at labor in the food industry called On the Job.
I would say my strongest food memory growing up was I used to do my homework sitting on the kitchen island. So I'd have my textbooks open while my mom made the chonk, like when she would sizzle ghee and add cumin seeds and asafoetida and red chili powder and make the house smell amazing. But more than that, I remember trying to sell back my textbooks at the end of the year, and I wasn't able to sell any of them back because they were all splattered with cumin seeds and turmeric, so they're still sitting on my shelf at home in Dallas.
I'm so excited to be in conversation with you all today. I have a few questions. We'll be in conversation, and then we'll try to leave time closer to the end for audience questions. So if you do think of anything, hang on to it, and we'll try to get to it before we wrap up. Each of you have written a cookbook that is so, unique and tells your story, and there's a deep level of personal narrative alongside, the recipes. So I'd love to hear, and we can go in any order, feel free to chime in kind of like a chicken or egg thing, like which came first? Was it the recipes, or was it your personal narrative? And how did, whichever came first, how did it ultimately shape the final product? I'll call on people if no one
I'm happy to start. So I used to work for a food magazine called Lucky Peach that doesn't exist anymore, and we were writing a cookbook about vegetables. And they sent, the book was like, that they were going to submit the manuscript, and the editor sent me like the table of contents, and there were no Indian recipes. And I was like, how can you write a cookbook about vegetables with no Indian recipes? That seems crazy. And so I emailed my mom kind of in a hurry, being like, can you send me these recipes? My mom had never written down a recipe before. She sent me these recipes. I sent them to our recipe developer. And the next day, the recipe developer just like came up to me and was like, hey, I tested all your mom's recipes. They all worked perfectly, and we're gonna put all of them in the book. And, I feel like you grow up, everyone grows up thinking their mother is the best cook. But it was sort of in that moment that I was like, I actually think that my mom's cooking, which is, she learned to cook Indian food only when she immigrated to America using the ingredients she found in American grocery stores, and she was busy and only had 20 minutes to put dinner on the table. I was like, I actually think there is perhaps an audience for the recipes that she just intuitively developed. Like, I think there is this perception that Indian food is difficult to make at home, and my mom's recipes sort of suggest otherwise. And so it started with the recipes, but as I started writing the book, it sort of became this like really therapeutic dive into my identity and my insecurities, and that very classic feeling that children of immigrants have of feeling not Indian enough in Indian settings and not American enough in American settings. But for me, it started with the recipes.
I feel like similarly to Priya, I feel like I started with recipes first, and I think like it's hard, I guess, to like show exactly who you are if no one knows that. So I think the stories came a little bit after to kind of contextualize, why am I like Abi Balingit writing this book? Who is she? And like I feel like I interviewed my mom and my dad separately about like their stories of immigrating here from the Philippines in like the late 80s, early 90s, and it was very it was weird because it's like I feel like I've known those answers like my whole life, but it was in a different context of like, I have a purpose, I'm writing this book, and please answer these for the sake of my publisher. But no, it was more than that, and it was definitely exciting to kind of see how I think about food is because of my parents and their like willingness to like explore, and I think that was like really impactful for me.
Okay. I wrote a memoir, and it did start that way. I have to tell you first what motivated me. Fear. I was afraid of many things. I was afraid to forget. I was afraid to write. I was afraid I was not good enough to write. And I was afraid nobody will read my book. So, backtrack, more than 20 years ago, one night, close to midnight, I was baking ensaymades. That's a Filipino brioche. And it was close to midnight because the process takes nearly 2 days to make. I was sprinkling grated cheese over the buttery buns, and the phone rang. Because it was nearly midnight, my husband and my sons were asleep. I didn't want to pick up the phone because they will hear. And I'm thinking, who's calling me at midnight? So I let the machine take the message. The machine said, there was an old man's voice, and he said, "You don't know me, but your mother saved my life." All right, I stopped. I'm thinking, is this a prank call? So I pick up the phone. I nearly slip on the floor because there was butter all over. And then he said, "Are you the daughter of Lulu Reyes? I've been searching for her for 50 years. She saved my life." And he explained that he was an American war veteran. He had been a POW during World War II in the Philippines. He had malaria, among other illnesses. And he had been transferred from prison to prison to prison camp. And it was my mother who smuggled medicines to save his life. And here he was, 50 years after, searching for her. He found me in the suburbs of New Jersey, where I have an unlisted phone. And this was a time when the internet was not yet, the way it is today. So we developed a phone friendship. This American veteran, he had retired with his wife. He was in the Midwest, and we talked every week. He would call me, and he told me all his war memories. He sent me his unpublished memoir. He talked about my mother and war stories. He talked about stories I had never heard before, and the dangers and all the things that my mother had to go through to smuggle food, aid, and medicine to American and Filipino war veterans. Through the years, he gave me a list of books to read where there were first-hand accounts about my mother. I read those books, and it led to more research. I researched for more war stories. And while researching, I went through my mother's things, and I found old recipes dating back to my great-grandmother at the turn of the century. And before you knew it, I had boxes of old pictures, old recipes, old letters. And Mr. Dow, the war veteran, told me, well, why don't you write a book? Oh, I can't. And this is where the fear set in. He eventually passed away, and I kept all this stuff with me. Then the pandemic happened. I had the gift of time. I had nothing else to do. We were all on lockdown. And I took out all my grandmother's recipes, my mother's old letters, and Mr. Dow's old memoir, and I started to read it again. And then I realized, if I don't write this story, who else will? So that's how it was, and here we are.
Here we are.
Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing all of that. So we can share if we need to. We're on this panel that has, that terms you all as Asian American writers. Each of you have, created recipes and written books that focus on, a specific country in Asia. But even as, you're kind of designated as a Korean American writer or Filipino American writer, that in itself encompasses so many different regions and cultures and communities, languages. There's this constant tension between the general and the specific at different levels. Can you just talk about how you personally grapple with that? Do you think about it? Does it not occur? How does that kind of ongoing tension that I do feel is uniquely Asian American play into your work?
I'll start. Okay, and we'll stop doing this microphone thing. So I think for me it was, like Betty Ann, a lot of fear that started my journey of writing Korean American anyway. It's because I had just been laid off from my job, and then my first assignment at the Times was like a month or two later. And it was about Korean food. And I went into that assignment so naive, but I'd also just gotten the book deal, so I was starting this journey of writing about Korean food very publicly, and I did not understand how serious other Koreans would take that, how seriously. And I think what happened for me was the piece published, I was so excited. I remember I went to the park to see my friends, we celebrated for like a couple hours. I came home, and my editor had gotten an email from a Korean journalist, like another Korean American journalist, who wrote this long thing about how incorrect I had gotten it. It was a piece about kimchi, and I had started a book about Korean American cuisine, so my focus was about Korean food in America, in the United States, because that's something I could offer. So my kind of introduction was, well, Jack London is someone who wrote down Korean food when he was over there during the war. And so the reference to kimchi in the context of America starts with him, like in terms of like historically written down data. So, but this person, it was at a really, we all remember 2020. It was a very tense time for media and representation in general. And it wasn't enough that I was a Korean person writing about Korean food. I think that's when I called Priya, actually. I don't think she'll mind me telling the story. But I called her and I was like, so this weird thing happened to me. I was so excited about this piece, but then I got this horrible, I don't know how to explain it. It was criticism from my own people, but largely the editors, we all decided that it was kind of unfounded. There was like nothing actually incorrect about the piece, but that's when we started talking about this scarcity mindset. And so there were just realizing that me being myself, getting an assignment, writing about Korean food for the New York Times, that made a lot of Korean people angry. They were like, why is he doing that? Why isn't it me? And then it took a year or two to really understand that political situation, that environment of scarcity, and then now with some more empathy, I totally understand it. But that's how I had to start. And so the whole book, I think ultimately it was a good thing because it helped me to really lean into my academic training, my fact-checking. It wasn't just a memoir anymore, it was a book that other Korean people would pick up, and then I wanted to make sure that they felt seen when they read it, because there was a big responsibility, which is why I called it Korean American. I had some friends, and some friends who like stopped being friends because the scarcity mindset. There was jealousy that I had taken that title. They were like, why do you get to own that title? But what I really wanted and what I really hoped was that seeing those two words just out there like over and over and over would uplift everyone else. And I won't say that like that's necessarily what happened, but I think I did have to think about the personal and the public, and I had to think about this work that I was doing wasn't just for me. It had to be something that other people could also own. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to write a book like that, because it also taught me about memoir writing and how it's in the specifics and being very specific and careful in telling your specific story that you're able to get some universal truths. And I think now whenever there are other Korean writers who are writing about Korean food, I'm just so delighted, because there should have always been a multiplicity of those kinds of voices. And so the book tour was very much about talking about stuff like that the whole time, and I didn't think that I would have to do that, but it was something that was inevitable, and I'm glad happened. And I also just love that we're on a panel about memoir writing and in our work, because usually in like those first few years, it was always about race. It was always about, when in reality, what I wanted to show people was that this is just that's like the baseline. It's like a foundation. That's part of everything. So it's nice to be invited to talk about our work and not just be asked to come in and do a whole discussion about diversity or something like that, you know? I mean, Priya and I have been on many panels together, and we're finally getting to talk about our work. Thank you. It's like amazing, you know?
That's why you come to Asian American Writers Workshop programs. Go ahead, Priya.
I think one thing I noticed when I was about to start writing Indianish was I would go to like Barnes and Noble, and all of the cookbooks by non-white authors that offered non-white flavors were bunched in the international section. And I felt so, like, even if that author was American, if the food that they made felt very distinctly American, even if it was influenced by Filipino culture, Korean culture, it was always slotted in the international section. And I was like, I want to write a book that they will not slot it in the international section. And so I wrote on the cover, recipes and antics from a modern American family, because the reality is, I grew up in the US. My mom only learned to cook in the US. Her mother hated cooking. My mom did not learn to cook in India. Her cooking is very much influenced, yes, by her memories of growing up in India, but also moving to America and finding community in Indians who came from all over Rajasthan, Gujarat, Kerala. So yes, my mother's from Uttar Pradesh, and you can see traces of that in the words she uses and the types of recipes that are sort of her staples. But the book really, if you think about it, it kind of jumps around regionally. But I never wanted to be like, this is the definitive cookbook on Indian food. I am not an expert on Indian food. I would never claim to be an expert on Indian food. India is this hugely diverse country. It's not a monolith. And so I very much wanted to present the book as like, these are the recipes of my family. And my mom's recipe for pav bhaji is probably not the same as your nani's recipe for pav bhaji. And that's okay, because food is dynamic, it's elastic, it travels. You know, my mom she has tweaked her recipes over time to account for what was available, to account for how much time she had, to account for her schedule. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about food. So for me, it was sort of in being as specific as possible, but not to like the regionality of Indian food, but the specificity of my experience. That was sort of where I found the magic.
I will say that, like, if Priya did not write Indianish and if Eric Kim did not write Korean American, I don't think my book would be here, because it was such a, it's a thing of like, we are all Asian American, but we're not like homogenizing like our experiences or anything, but it is uplifting to see other people in the diaspora winning and succeeding, and that's like all you kind of want to see is like, I want to not just be the only person with a Filipino American cookbook. And Betty Ann also, like, her dessert cookbook helped me as well with just like, I would look at her desserts as like, okay, what is like tenets of Filipino cuisine? And like everyone's work is so like cumulative and like stands on the shoulders of like giants and stuff. And so it is interesting to like be in a unique position in like where you are in your identity, and to kind of, where do you fall in that conversation, and to literally be in conversation, which is so cool. But that was all I just like wanted to say about that.
Okay, so the question is, again, how do we balance between being general and being specific about food, and in my case, Filipino food? The thing is, I attach, in my memoir, Every Ounce of Courage, I attach a personal anecdote to the description of the recipe, to the description of what was happening. And I ended up intersecting history, culture, and food in the descriptions. And it was difficult, I admit. Memoir writing is one of the hardest things to do. I was able to describe, in good times, post-war, present day, I was able to describe the abundance of good food. And one of my goals was to make the reader drool over sawsawans, over pancit, over lumpia, over the tangy flavor of lechon sauce, over grilling pork barbecue, or over steamed fish. Another hard part, and very difficult, I admit, was to write about the war and food. The lack of food, the famine, the painful, horrible experience of that part of our history. And I was able to write about the mind-numbing, desperate longing of a prisoner of war for his mother's cooking. And I admit, I cried when I had to do that, because I remember that people I loved had to endure that. So that went into the food writing. So that makes it personal.
I love
Thank
that.
you.
I'd love to hear what you all think about the word authenticity. Are you, in your work, what does it mean for your work? Are you redefining it for yourself? Is it something that you think about, or is it something that for your own personal creative process, that pressure you need to put aside? Just how does it play into what you all do, if at all?
I guess like my initial gut reaction is like cringing, because I hate that word sometimes so much. I do feel like being Filipino American, I would get a lot of pushback from people, especially in the Philippines, who's like, who is she? Why is she like making an adobo chocolate chip cookie? And it is really, it's just so weird, because it feels like food is also, super, super important, but in a way it's like, these things, it's just a cookie. It's not going to kill you. Like, I don't know. And so I guess like there's a levity that I like to address with some parts of like authenticity, because I feel very true to myself when I make recipes. And I also try to, if it is originally from the Philippines, in terms of like inspiration, it's like I try to like, this is the region where it's from. But also like, because there's like so much fusion influence in my own baking style, like I also like, okay, this is also Southern. This, you could probably find this in North Carolina. So just to be clear, but yeah, it is a push and pull. It's so complicated. I don't love the word authenticity.
I feel like my relationship to that word has evolved in the last few years, and I can't tell 100% if it's a personal relationship to it or the conversation in general has just changed in the public. But I certainly know that Korean American, that was my main, I told you about the fear that I had earlier, the feedback, the vitriol I was getting online from other Koreans. So that became like a through line in my work at the New York Times, which I started soon after I finished the book. And the more I wrote about that, the more I was able to, again, just like make it a baseline assumption in more recent pieces. What I mean by that is, earlier pieces would be directly addressing, oh my God, did you know that not all Koreans make mandu the same? Did you know that some people in Hawaii do it very differently? And then it's like walking through those little like baby steps for a reader. It's pretty draining, and even then you don't get it right. People have poor reading comprehension, and they can't really like grasp that. If they see a photo and they're like, oh, my mom's doesn't do it like that. That's not authentic Korean. But all of that stems from the scarcity mindset. It stems from, I think, the more empathy I kind of was able to garner and gain within myself for people who struggle with that. I was able to instead provide more hard evidence in my recent work. I realized that instead of constantly saying, not all Koreans make mandu the same, I realized, let me just show you. Let me show you 5 different versions. Let me report this out and give you evidence of what's actually happening in the real world, because that's my job as a reporter for the Times especially, and just as a food writer in general. And I think that really delights people, because it frees you from that word that we all hate, authenticity. And I think the last thing I'll just say is I realized that people were ready to hear that, and I think now people get it a little more, and I don't have to like hammer it into people anymore. But I think that's because the conversation about Korean food in the United States has changed, and since I started writing about it in like 2018. So I think it's nice that it's evolving as our interests just get more nuanced, and we can just write about the world, and that's good enough.
Okay, authenticity is something that I've had to prove my authenticity so many times all this time. I belong to a different generation than Eric or Abby or Priya. And I've had to prove myself, not just to the Filipino community, because I'm a home cook. I'm not a trained culinary chef. I'm a food writer. I'm a writer by profession. Both ways I've had to prove through the years to Filipinos, to Americans, to different generations that I can do this. This is what I do. And this is what you're reading about. It used to bother me, it used to worry me, but I realize I am who I am. I've accepted, I've come to terms with that, and I figured out how to make my way as a niche market food, how to make my way in this vast, mainstream, big country. Not everyone is cooking Filipino food every day. My own sons admit that. They probably cook Filipino food once a month, they said, because they're busy with lives, and they can't go food shopping in the Asian grocery every day. So I've come to accept this is my, this is just my niche, this is my area, and what you see is what you get. So, yeah, that's how I've dealt with it all this time. Thank you.
I guess I'm just curious as a follow-up to that. I think about the amount of vitriol that Abby, Eric, and I get for doing the things that we do and presenting the recipes we do. Like, what was that like for you when you were coming up, when you were food writing? What did you hear from your own community, and even from non-Filipinos about like the recipes you were putting out?
Well, I'm not a chef by profession. I'm not, but I studied. I found my way through studying, through learning, through taking cooking classes, and reading books, and so many things that one does to learn. How do I deal with it? Shut it out.
I think
Everybody can say what they want to say. What do you want me to do? I'm not going to change. This is the way I am. So, yeah.
I think for the record, all four of us are home cooks. None of
Yeah.
us have, like, I worked in restaurants, but none of us went to culinary school. I think, you know, maybe a generation ago, there was this real, like, valuation of culinary pedigree. And I think we now hopefully exist in an era that really, like, celebrates the home cook in a way that we didn't before. There is real brilliance in home cooking, in people who didn't train, and people who just have to figure it out based off of what they have, who didn't learn knife skills in culinary school, who just, like, developed their own intuitions just based off of, like, living in this world. And I think my mom is truly one of the most brilliant cooks, and I've interviewed cooks and chefs from around the world, and I think that our generation has really learned to be super unapologetic about that in a way that perhaps your generation, like, wasn't allowed to be at the time.
Yeah. Well, I have a quick follow-up to that. One time, somebody, I was making cooking videos, YouTube videos, not yet Instagram, and somebody criticized my hands. The way I was chopping something, and I got so insecure that ever since that time, I can't do what Eric does. Eric does brilliant YouTube video. You should watch his bibimbap video.
So my next question was going to be, do you have any questions for each other? So I love that that happened by itself, but we can continue that. We have a couple more minutes, and then I do want to see if we have time for maybe one or two audience questions. But do you have any other questions for each other as you're, you know, hearing more and learning about each other's work?
Personal or
Anything.
professional?
It can be about belts if we need.
I wanted to know from each of you, what's your craft process like in terms of, you know, we all have to cook and write, and so I love the specificity of how everyone gets words onto the page differently, because it's very it's a very different process for each person. I'm just curious how you guys get into the writing mode.
I do feel like if someone hacks into my notes app, it's going to be a scary place. And that's honestly like where all like my recipe ideas are. Like it starts with like pink peppercorn ? And it's like, I think that like the process, it's nice when someone gives you like kind of like a set task. I have to make a cookie recipe and I have to do that specifically. And then I sometimes just think of like a dish that I actually just like that might not even be sweet. It could be very savory, and be like, what are the notes that I like best in that? And where can I balance that with dessert? Because it's my most common like medium. But yeah, it's very interesting it's all kind of internal and not as much as like talking with someone as I'd like to. I feel like I'm just talking to myself, but like it's really great and honestly good to kind of look back at what you also scrapped in previous kind of iterations of what you wanted to make. And sometimes that turns into something completely different and completely new. But it is kind of like it's not as organized as I would like it to be.
I remember when I was writing Indianish, it started with my mom just sort of writing her recipes down and then me looking at them, testing them, and asking her a bunch of questions. But what's really lovely about how our relationship has evolved is now, you know, I talk to her on the phone like every day, every other day, and she'll literally just like give me a little seed of like, oh, you know, the other day I had like a leftover spoonful of almond butter, and I wondered like, what would happen if I put this in sabzi? Would it like add the nutty flavor? Would it sort of create this tempura-like coating? And I was like, oh, that's an interesting idea. And then I'll take that nugget, and then the next night at dinner, I'll be like, all right, well, I got a little almond butter. Let me try it. And I'll try it, and then I'll call her, and I'll be like, yeah, so I tried it with the almond butter, and I found that if you add the aromatics later in the recipe, like this happens. And so one thing that's been really amazing is like this one-way relationship between me and my mom has really turned into this really cool exchange where I feel like we can sort of read each other's minds and we exist on the same wavelength. And I ended up getting stuck in Dallas with my parents during lockdown, and basically my mom and I would go for walks after dinner, these like digestive walks, and we would just discuss what we were going to make for dinner the next day. And it was basically like us ping-ponging back and forth. And so it's really been cool to see like the process evolve in that way, because my mom has such good ideas, and I feel like we sort of take each other's ideas and make something that's sort of greater than the sum of its parts. It's like sort of been this really cool evolution of our relationship.
Wait, what did that taste like? Did you like it?
Yeah, it's coming to New York Times Cooking in a month or two.
That sounds amazing. All right, we have just a few minutes. I think we have time for maybe 2 audience questions, if there are any. And I'll repeat it in case anybody can't hear.
I was curious for all of you, how does your kind of success for writing help with your books, right? You can say books were sold or I wrote it exists. So would love to know.
So the question is, how does each of our writers define success for their writing?
I guess like it's very personal for me, but sometimes it's like my cousin. When I went on my book tour this year, like I was stopped in San Francisco, and I'm originally from California. And then I remember bringing, like they had my book in their kitchen and in their rooms. And I was like, I'm here, like, you want me to sign your book? They're like, no, we want to wait for like the book event at the bookstore. And that really like touched me, and like it made me feel like no matter like how many books this, sold or anything, it's like that kind of pride in that, and like younger generations being like, I can write a book too. And I was like it touched me a lot. I was really emo about it.
Man, that's a great question. Korean American was up for a couple awards on Friday and lost, so it's very fresh in mind. The bitterness didn't last very long because I was surrounded by my colleagues in this industry, and it's a very small industry, food and writing. It's pretty specific. And so I think for me, it was just, I'll always remember that first day. It was January 1st, 2020. I was holding my book, and it was my first time holding it, the physical copy. They had mailed it to my mom. I thought it would be appropriate for her to get it first. I flew into Atlanta that day, and I held it. And at first I was like, I don't feel anything. Like this is. But then I really I kept it in the bed with me, and then like as the night went into, I was like holding it and just like bawling. It's like, yes, okay, now I get it, and this feels. I think it was that moment. Just having it be a physical object is all that matters.
First of all, success. I ask myself that. How do I define success? And personally, to me, I think my success. I will feel successful if somebody read my book, if my stories has touched even just one person, one family, one community. Because if that happens, that's what my mother would have liked, and I wrote my memoir in honor of her. She would have liked that because she lived her life every day to make a difference in someone's life. So to me, if I can do that, if I can just have 5 people read my book right now, then that'll make me happy, and that to me is success. Thank you.
That's really beautiful. For me, it was probably when my dad has been bothering me to go to graduate school and join a consulting company for a really long time. And I think a few months after Indianish came out, he just sort of stopped asking me when I was going to graduate school or joining a consulting company. And to me, that was like greater than any number of book sales.
That's amazing. Ultimate victory. We do have to wrap it up here, but we're going to do lightning round recommendations just to end. So really quick, it could be a book, a restaurant. What are we recommending to people today? And we'll just go down the line.
Okay, if you really like donuts, there's a great Filipino donut bakery called Cora, and you should definitely go. It's in Queens.
My favorite burger right now is at Cafe Paulette. It's right under Fort Greene Park.
Oh, I would highly recommend you please buy and read everyone's cookbooks and watch
Eric's YouTube videos because they're so good and so helpful. So, yeah.
I love everything that Brian Washington and Rachel Kong write. They're two of my favorite novelists. They both have books coming out. Brian's is called Family Meal. Rachel's is called Real Americans, and I'm really excited to read both.
Thank you all so much. I could chat with you all day. They will be signing their books downstairs. Please buy, visit, say hello. Thank you all for being here. Enjoy the rest of the festival.